Hello, this is your teacher, Mr. Billman, and I'm here to talk about the final research project. This is a three-part project where you will first design, run and gather your data, and then finally analyze your own research project and write it up for a eventual presentation, assuming all of this coronavirus stuff finally ends. Right now, we're currently in the design phase where your job is going to be primarily to design an experiment based on some idea that you come up with. You have to write out the purpose of the study, its general background to give some sort of motivation for why this study exists, eventually culminating in an actual description of how the experiment is run, and finally an actual list of instructions so someone could run it in your stead. On the actual website that you'll find, the Google Classroom, you'll notice that there are multiple documents. This first document is just simply the design phase research document, which happens to contain a brief description of things that must be included in order for this to be given, along with a couple of ideas for what you can do, and finally the grading rubric being on the second page. Ultimately, you can choose to do this project on anything you want, but I would suggest doing something which is easy to do. I've given several options to give you an idea for what I think would be a pretty easy task. I know that since a lot of people are currently locked up in their houses and basically not moving, that it might not be easy to do all of these things. When I originally designed this, I thought we'd have more time, but that is just how the cookie crumbles sometimes. But here are some ideas, regardless, that you could possibly get an idea of. For example, do people remember more words a week now than tested repeatedly or given multiple study sessions? This is really just an example of what is called the testing effect. You also happen to have other ideas. For example, is the relationship between age and intelligence? Is there a difference in how long it takes to cut fruit to spoil under different conditions? If you cut fruit, it starts to brown, for example. If you leave it plain versus lemon juice versus dipping in isopropyl alcohol, assuming you could get a hold of some of it before all the shelves disappeared, then you could go ahead and run that test. These are all pretty simple ideas, and what you want to run your test on can be pretty much anything. I even included one on social media, because since we're all locked up, I figure this might be the easiest thing to gather data off of. But ultimate matters is that you gather some amount of data, which you will then eventually use for an experiment of some sort. You'll need some sort of background citations, which I'll talk about more in a second. You also need a description of the experimental manipulation and controls. The randomization process must also be described. If you don't tell me how it was randomized, then I will assume it was not done properly. I also, of course, need clear and well-written instructions to an experimenter, because the reality is that in the real world, if you were doing this, you would probably not be the only person running the experiment. There would likely be someone else whose job it was to run the experiment. Also, you know what kind of data you're collecting. So, are you interested specifically in the means and the counts of some people? That is to say, when I say counts, things like the number of people who are using social media versus, say, the number of tweets that someone makes per day, on average. Going down to the grading rubric, I've split it into 3 groups. Each one is weighted evenly, 5 points each, into 4 categories: purpose and background, experimental design, experiment instructions, and grammar and spelling. When it comes to grammar and spelling, for the most part, this is not an English class, so I'm not going to sit there and nitpick every single flaw in your writing style. Generally speaking, when it comes to grammatical errors, I'm only going to target ones which interrupt the flow of reading. So small error like misspelling something, while certainly you shouldn't be doing that. We live in a world of instant spell check. It's not going to be the sort of thing I'm going to punish you heavily for. If, however, I'm trying to read your paper and I just can't, that's going to be a bigger issue when it comes to grammar and spelling. In fact, frankly, I say that if you have severe errors, it's going to give you a 1 on this, which would suggest it only drops 4. But generally speaking, a person with severe grammar and spelling errors usually also has problems with the other 3 as well, making it so I literally can't grade anything. So generally speaking, as long as you do well on grammar, this is a pretty easy 5 points to get. For everything else, everything else I'm going to describe in more detail in a second what it's about, but the big things are the purpose and background. It needs to describe what it is you're trying to do, why it is you think this is an interesting thing, and just generally speaking, you're trying to motivate why it is we're doing this study in the first place. Now, understand that I'm not expecting you to do anything original, that you're not doing original research. I'm not even going to sit there and require that you do anywhere near the amount of research that you would need to do if this were, say, a college level or graduate level paper. But I want to see at least 1 or 2 sources. I do not care if they're internet sources. I just need to see 1 or 2 sources. I also need to see them cited, which we'll talk about more later. And I also need that those sources are directly related to your experiment. If you design an experiment that does not match your stated purpose, that's going to be a big issue. And that brings us, of course, to experimental design. Generally speaking, your experimental design, the big thing I'm going to care about is, does the experiment design remotely deal with measuring something? So a specific example, let's say we were going with the who uses social media, men or women. If you sat there and designed an experiment that, say, asked, checked to see if it was a man or a woman, and then let's say counted the number of tweets that they did per week on average, this would make sense. I would be okay with this. If, on the other hand, you just simply asked them, do you think you use a lot of social media? This would also be okay, but you'd have to justify why this is fine. However, if you gave something more like, you just said that you think that so-and-so uses a lot of basically, if whatever your data you're using doesn't pertain directly to what you're looking for, the goal of your study, you probably shouldn't be using it. Generally speaking, this is just mostly, does it make sense? If it makes any sense, you probably get at least 3 points. Now, when it comes to everything else, it's going to come down to, are there any obvious confounds and randomization problems? Now, I say obvious confounds. I don't just mean that maybe there's some small thing that you could have checked for. What I'm saying is, if you, let's say you run an experiment where you're trying to, let's go with the fruit experiment, and you take your apple and you proceed to go ahead and test how long it takes for it to go ahead and spoil, but you do this test in an oven set at 180 degrees. This would be an obvious confound, because obviously the temperature of the oven is going to be an issue. If the confound is not obvious, especially if I cannot see it on a brief cursory glance, I'm going to be fine. If I have to do research to find the confound, you're good. Generally speaking, when I say obvious confound, I mean it's something that is obviously bad and contradicts your evidence and your intentions. And also when it comes to randomization, I mostly mean that you have some randomizing process and that you happen to describe it well enough, particularly when you get to experiment instructions. Understand that randomization is not always possible, but I do want you guys to try using it. If you find you have problems using randomization in a particular study, for example, I will admit it might be difficult to do randomization in social media. Maybe you have like 100, maybe you have like 200 or 300 friends and can do a randomized sample from those 200 friends. I don't know, you could try that. But if you're like me and don't use social media very often, it might not be an option. So I'll let you come up with that. But generally speaking, I just want to make sure you know how to use randomization. When it comes to experiment instructions, this is the last part. Once you've designed your experiment, you have to give me the instructions that describe exactly how you would run it. And the main goal here is, your assumption is whoever's reading these instructions has no idea how to do an experiment. They have no idea how to design an experiment, control an experiment, and so on. So your goal is to think through every single confound you think might screw things up, and then literally write instructions. The idea being that these instructions should be so easy that even your little brother could run your experiment. Even your sister could run this experiment, assuming they followed the instructions. That one key is assuming they follow the instructions. The main key here is that they could run the study. Now understand, if your instructions are less clear, like let's say you don't describe exactly what you mean when you say and then hand them the materials or whatever, then that's going to be something where you're going to lose some points. If it's not clear, if it's not obvious to literally anyone what they mean, that's going to be when you start losing points. Mainly it's going to come down to, could anyone understand these instructions? So, with all of that said, let's go look at the template I designed. Now, the idea behind this template is pretty simple. I wanted to give you guys an idea as to what this would look like, because you haven't seen a design document before, and realistically speaking, you have to learn how to write these. They differ from department to department. Some fields don't even really require a design document, or more correctly, they might have a design setup, but it'll be inside of, say, a proposal instead of a straight-up design document. This is a more simple version of what you might see, though it does contain most of the positions you might see. Your name would obviously go here. Most of everything else is is written up there. I would change the research name to whatever the name of your research is. Come up with a snazzy name if you desire, or maybe not. I also have it split up into several sections. Now, these sections, I'm going to give a description as to what I expect in each one. You do not have to use this exact template, but this template does give you an idea as to what I'm expecting. The purpose and motivation is more or less this is just a brief blurb, a few sentences, maybe a paragraph, describing exactly what you're interested in. You might have a citation in here talking about, say, a TV show that you watched where something happened and you just don't think that's believable and you want to prove them wrong. Or maybe a book where you read something that was interesting, but you aren't really sure if it's real and you want to test it. That sort of thing. This is where you're going to talk about your purpose and your motivation behind making this experiment. At this point, we then get into the background. Now, in an actual research paper, this would usually be called the introduction, where you have large sections of research and background research going in there. In most research papers, this is the longest section and can sometimes be as long as 5, 10, 15 pages. However, this is obviously a high school thing, and I'm not really expecting much more than just that you did a little bit of research on what it is you're interested in. And if you happen to notice any other research that you've seen or any other talking about it, I don't expect you to give me a really detailed description of everything, nor do I expect you to go ahead and know how to use Google Scholar to find all of the research, though obviously props to you if you can use Google Scholar to find this research. It's always a nice thing to go ahead and back up your research with the idea that someone else has done something like it or similar. But ultimately, all I care about when it comes to the background is that you know how to do some level of research, and if there's some motivation behind this, then I need to I need to write a project for a class, and that's the whole reason why I'm doing this. I know that that's probably true for most of you, but I want to see some more effort than that. Experimental design, this is where you're going to actually write the design of the experiment. Now, I want to be clear, all the things I would expect in here. This is going to be where if you have any materials, you describe your materials, the apparatus, how they're set up and provided. If you happen to have something more detailed, let's say you want to include a picture of what it looks like, or you want to include like a page, let's say you're having someone take an online survey, which might be appropriate given our current circumstances, then then you might want to show me a picture of what that survey looks like. Those things really belong in the appendix, which is down here. But for anything else, just the general description of the experiment, how you're randomizing your data, how you selected for your population, how you gathered your population, all of those things should be going in here. Data and analysis. This is where you talk about what kind of data you're gathering. So if you're going to the social media thing, if you were just going ahead and asking people, do you use social media or not, then this is where you would tell me that that's what you did. That's the kind of data you're gathering. You also need to tell me what kind of data that is. In this case, that'd be a simple categorical yes or no. Using social media, does not use social media, that sort of thing. And you might also give me things like, what is the amount of data you have? So let's say men, 37% of them use social media. In this case, you're just going to be describing what kind of data you would have, but you'll also be describing to some extent how you would probably report the data. Because understand that data reporting is important. It's how you ensure you can show people that what you're doing is valid and that you're not hiding the ball and trying to confuse them and make them think you've got something when you really don't. And finally, your analysis. It's important to start talking about your analysis during the design phase. If you wait until you run the experiment to actually start thinking about your analysis, you might find that you spend in the real world $1 million gathering data only to find that the analysis you're trying to run won't work, which means all of the data you just gathered, all the money you just spent, worthless, you can throw it out. So it's a good idea to get in the habit at the very beginning, before you've even talked to your first person, before you've even gathered your first data point, to think about how you're going to analyze it. So keep in mind that most of this will just come down to what kind of test are you going to run. Make sure you talk about what your assumptions are and how you're going to meet those assumptions. So if you have a requirement for normality, so which most of the systems I've taught you guys do have a requirement for normality, you'll be learning later what's called chi-square, which doesn't have this requirement, but the main point is that if you have that requirement, you need to describe to me how you're going to satisfy it. Probably something like a sample size. Or if you can't get that sample size, perhaps you'll instead describe it differently. If you're worried that you might not be able to perform this experiment later at a later date because of all of the junk happening to us right now, that's fine. Here's what I want you to do. Write it as though you could run the experiment. And then we'll hopefully be able to run it later, but if it turns out that all of this goes for naught and that you can't run it, I will grade this as the final project by itself, and you're fine. You're good. It doesn't matter that you couldn't run the data. You did your job anyway, and you'll have full credit. So, as I said, write this as though you do have the ability to run it later. But if you do not, then that's fine. This is where you're going to include your instructions. So the instructions that an actual experimenter is going to have to read, what you're going to describe to them, how you're going to describe it. This should be basically a list of instructions that anyone could read. And remember, I mean anyone. Don't write for me, don't write for a classmate, write for your 8-year-old little brother. Well, maybe not 8, that'd be a bit young, but the main point is that if they're able to read, they've never taken this class before, they can still run your experiment. As long as they can read it, that's good enough, and that's the important thing. It's also important to get your instructions out, because this is frankly going to help you get a sense as to how you're designing your experiment, what kind of experiment you're trying to design. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this with a couple of brief ideas for what you might write. So this is a specific example that I might come up with. I might sit there and think about running an experiment involving whether or not there are gender differences in color preference. There's actually been a lot of research on this, so this isn't unusual ideas or information. What it basically comes down to is this. Men tend to prefer colors, I believe, blue. Meanwhile, women, at least in the United States, tend to prefer green versus blue. Some of them a bit more on the red phase, but primarily green, blue, purple. And the question becomes, okay, well, what are the differences? And I might sit there and start writing in here. Well, I am interested in studying the differing preferences between men and women with regard to color preference. I might also sit there and start talking about what kind of research might be interested in here, or I might save all of that for background. I do want there to be at least a couple of sources. Now you might ask yourself, okay, well you have to cite sources, so how am I expecting to cite it? You may have noticed, for example, there's a references section on here, which I do expect you to fill out. I'm okay with anything that's consistent, but I would prefer if all of your citations were in APA format. It's not really that this class requires APA. It's more that I am personally used to APA. So when I see APA, I recognize it and understand it immediately. If you do not know how to use APA, there are plenty of APA guides, but the main things are that first, you can do an in-text citation by simply putting in parenthesis, author name. So, like, let's say typically their last name, and with a followed by a first letter for their first name, then a last name. So, like B regard, comma, and then if there's another person, you might add them here. So, T Willoughby. Didn't capitalize that T. 1 second while I fix that. And when you're done with all of your people, you would then write your dates. Let's say that this paper was published in 2018, in which case, here's your citation, and you would write that. If it is an internet citation, then you would write the name of the person and when it was published here. And in the references, you would describe, you would tell me what the website was, the specific URL that you went to, unless the website itself has a specific method for how it wants to be cited. You usually just give the URL along with who wrote it. But up here, once again in the text, you write who wrote the article. If there is no author to the article, then write the website you got it from along with the year, just make it clear as to where it came from. So when I go through the references later to start checking this stuff, I can. This is pretty much it for the description. Not all of these sections are required. For example, you do not need an appendix if you are not planning on including any pictures of your designs. I personally would prefer to see them because it makes it easier for me to get a handle on what it is you're trying to do. But if you don't have it, if it's just like, you're asking a couple of words or questions, then you might be able to get away with not having an appendix and just including it all in your experimental design. And once again, for your data analysis, all you have to do is go in there. And I would highly suggest that with your data analysis that you go ahead and you do a little bit of practice with a calculator. You'll notice over here I happen to have a nice little calculator, and I can actually start messing with said calculator exactly as you see here. So, for example, I might decide that I want to... let's say I want to go ahead and perform a statistical analysis. I might go to Stat, Edit. Then I sit there and add in some numbers. So let's say going back to that example, I want there to be, let's say I want to go ahead and figure out if men versus women happen to have, let's say, a larger amount of usage of social media. So I might in here write how many tweets they make. So like, let's say guy number 1 had 23 tweets per week. Sorry, 23 tweets per week. This guy number 2 had 12 tweets per week, 42 tweets per week, and so on, going all the way down the line. And let's say that we also do the same thing with women, and we find, let's just go ahead and say that 37 tweets, 22 tweets, 54 tweets, 9 tweets. Let's have a single-digit number. Someone in there doesn't use Twitter. One person had one Twitter thing where they just said coronavirus sucks, I don't know, and then another person doesn't even use it at all, say 0, and then we might say, okay, click stat, see if your analysis works. So go test, and then go over here to sample t-test. Boom. We are using data, so list 1, list 2, going down to here, calculate, and boom, here's our data along with our t-value, p-value, and so on. Keep in mind, you would not report this. This is more of a sanity check. Your goal is to find out if there's some reason to think that your analysis won't work. So understand that the data is literally made up, and I made it up specifically so I could just get a sense of what might the data look like, and that's really it. This doesn't have to be real data. You don't have to actually gather data to do this, but you have to understand what kind of data you're gathering and what it would look like, and it's a good idea to then see how you would run the analysis and see which one would give it to you. And you also generally want to understand how it would be done. What you're seeing here is an emulator for the TI-84. If you have an Inspire, you would obviously have a slightly different look. And if you have neither, you could probably go ahead buy one at Walmart still, or you could use something called Wabbit EMU, WABBIT EMU. They require that you have to already have a ROM for the TI-84, and for obvious legal reasons, I cannot tell you how to get a hold of one. You can get a hold of one by using a TI-84 that you own and getting the ROM from it, or by other means, which I'll let you determine through various Google searches. But as I said, for legal reasons, I obviously cannot go into more detail on that. I hope that this finds you well. I hope that all of you continue to stay healthy and strong. And if you have any questions, I will be paying attention to all of this throughout the mandatory lockdown that we all find ourselves in. So stay safe and have a wonderful day.